September 1944. The Hurtgen forest stretched across the German-Belgian border like a dark green scar, its ancient pines so densely packed that sunlight rarely touched the forest floor. American forces had been pushing eastward for weeks, but here, in this primordial woodland, the advance had ground to an exhausting crawl. Somewhere deep within those shadows, a young Cherokee marksman named Private First Class Thomas Walking Bear crouched motionless against a moss-covered boulder, his breath barely visible in the cold morning air. He had been in that exact position for nearly 11 hours. The commanders back at headquarters believed this sector would fall within days. They were convinced that superior numbers and firepower would overwhelm the defenders dug into the forest's countless ravines and ridgelines. What they failed to understand was that the Hurtgen would become one of the longest and most grueling campaigns American forces would face during the entire conflict in Europe. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened over the following 3 months would transform Thomas Walking Bear from an unknown replacement soldier into a legend whispered about in hushed tones on both sides of the line. His unconventional methods, drawn from centuries of Cherokee hunting wisdom passed down through his family, would prove devastatingly effective in ways that no military training manual had ever anticipated. This is the story of how one man's ancestral knowledge created a tactical advantage that modern warfare had never seen. Thomas Walking Bear was born in 1923 on the Cherokee Reservation in northeastern Oklahoma, the third of 7 children in a family that traced its lineage back to those who had survived the Trail of Tears nearly a century before. His grandfather, a man everyone called Old Bear, had been the last traditional hunter in the family, and from the age of 6, Thomas had followed him through the Ozark foothills, learning the old ways of tracking and concealment. "The deer does not see the hunter," Old Bear would say in Cherokee, a language Thomas spoke before he learned English. "The deer sees movement. The deer sees shape. The deer sees what does not belong. You must become what belongs." These lessons seemed like childhood games at the time, exercises in patience and stillness that Thomas endured because he loved his grandfather. He had no way of knowing that these ancient techniques would one day save his life countless times in a forest half a world away. When the conflict in Europe began, Thomas was working at a sawmill in Tulsa, sending money home to help support his younger siblings. He enlisted in January of 1943, not out of any particular patriotism, but because, as he wrote to his mother, "If I have to go anyway, I might as well choose when." His scores at basic training were unremarkable, except for one category: marksmanship. On the rifle range at Fort Benning, Thomas shot a perfect score 3 times in succession, drawing the attention of Sergeant Major William Crawford, a career soldier who had trained sharpshooters for 20 years. "Where did you learn to shoot like that, Private?" Crawford asked, after watching Thomas place 10 rounds through essentially the same hole at 200 yards. "My grandfather taught me to hunt," Thomas replied simply. Crawford recommended him for advanced marksmanship training, and by the summer of 1944, Thomas Walking Bear had completed the specialized course that would designate him as a precision marksman. He was shipped to Europe as a replacement, arriving in France just as Allied forces were preparing their push toward the German border. The Hurtgen forest had been a relatively quiet sector when Thomas arrived with the 28th Infantry Division in mid-September. The forest covered roughly 50 square miles of rugged terrain, with elevations ranging from 1,000 to 2,000 feet above sea level. The trees, mostly fir and pine, grew so close together that armored vehicles could not penetrate more than a few yards from the firebreak roads. Artillery was nearly useless because the shells detonated in the treetops, showering wooden fragments on anyone below. It was, as one officer grimly observed, a place where industrial-age armies faced medieval conditions. The German forces defending the forest had spent months preparing their positions. They knew every trail, every clearing, every stream crossing. They had pre-registered their mortar positions with mathematical precision and established interlocking fields of observation that made any American movement extremely dangerous during daylight hours. Within the first week, Thomas's company had lost 32 men to various hazards, and they had advanced less than 800 yards. It was during this desperate period that Thomas began experimenting with techniques his grandfather had taught him decades earlier in Oklahoma. The first principle was simple but profound. Never move when your shadow moves separately from other shadows. In the dense forest, where shafts of light penetrated the canopy at irregular angles, this meant understanding exactly how the sun's position would affect every possible movement. Most men think about where they're going, Thomas explained years later to a military historian. I thought about where my shadow was going. In that forest, your shadow would give you away faster than anything else. It moved differently than the shadows of the trees. It didn't belong. Thomas developed what he called his shadow map technique. Each morning before dawn, he would study the sector he intended to operate in, memorizing the angles of light that would penetrate the canopy throughout the day. He identified what he called shadow corridors, routes where the natural darkness of the forest floor would mask his own shadow regardless of the sun's position. These corridors were often counterintuitive, sometimes requiring him to move away from his objective for hours before approaching from an unexpected direction. His first significant success came on September 23rd. American intelligence had identified an observation post on a ridgeline that was calling in mortar rounds with devastating accuracy. 2 previous attempts to neutralize the position had failed, with the approach teams detected and pinned down before they could get within effective range. The company commander, Captain Harold Morrison, was desperate. "Walking Bear," Morrison said, spreading a map across a fallen log at the command post. "I've heard you're good at sneaking around. Can you get close enough to that ridge to do something about our problem?" Thomas studied the map, then asked to see the terrain from the nearest forward observation point. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. The direct approaches to the ridge all crossed areas where morning sunlight would penetrate the canopy, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that would make any movement visible. "I can get there," Thomas said finally, "but not until tomorrow afternoon. I need to go around through the creek bed to the north." Morrison looked skeptical. "That's almost 2 miles out of the way, and you'd be approaching from the wrong direction. The sun will be in their eyes by then," Thomas explained, "and the creek bed stays dark all day. No direct light reaches it. My shadow will never separate from the ground shadow." Morrison had no better options, so he approved the plan. Thomas left before dawn the next morning, moving through the forest with a patience that would have seemed maddeningly slow to any observer. He covered the first mile in approximately 6 hours, never rising above a crouch, timing each movement to coincide with the natural sway of branches in the wind. When he reached the creek bed, he moved even more slowly, sliding through the shallow water inch by inch. His body pressed so close to the rocks that he was essentially part of the stream bed. The observation post was manned by 3 soldiers. Thomas could see them clearly from his position 200 yards below the ridge, concealed in a tangle of exposed tree roots at the creek's edge. They were relaxed, confident in their concealment, occasionally scanning the approaches they expected any threat to come from. None of them ever looked toward the creek. Why would they? No one in their right mind would spend an entire day crawling through freezing water. Thomas waited another hour until the sun was exactly where he wanted it, blazing directly into the eyes of anyone looking westward from the ridge. Then, with 3 carefully aimed shots spaced approximately 10 seconds apart, he neutralized the observation post. The mortar situation affecting American positions improved that afternoon. Captain Morrison was incredulous when Thomas returned to the command post that evening. 3 confirmed from 200 yards in that terrain? How did you even get close enough to see them? Thomas shrugged. "I went where my shadow wouldn't go before me." Word of Thomas's success spread quickly through the division. Within days, he was being loaned out to other companies facing similar problems, positions that seemed impossible to approach, observers who seemed to see everything, strong points that had resisted every conventional effort. Each time Thomas would study the terrain, calculate his shadow corridors, and find a way through defenses that had stopped every other soldier. The German forces began to notice that something unusual was happening. Positions that should have been impregnable were being neutralized by an invisible threat. Survivors reported hearing nothing, seeing nothing, until suddenly their comrades went down and chaos erupted. The forest, which had been their ally for weeks, now seemed to harbor a ghost. A captured document from October 19th revealed the extent of German concern. An intelligence officer had written a report theorizing that the Americans had deployed a new type of specialist, possibly using advanced camouflage technology that the Germans had not yet encountered. The report recommended that all forward positions be reinforced and that observation be increased during the afternoon hours, when most of the unexplained incidents seemed to occur. They never guessed that the advanced technology was knowledge passed down from a Cherokee grandfather to his 6-year-old grandson in the hills of Oklahoma. By late October, Thomas had been credited with neutralizing 19 confirmed positions, all from locations that had been classified as unapproachable, but his greatest achievement was yet to come. November 2nd, 1944. The 28th Division was preparing for a major push toward the town of Schmidt, a key objective that controlled several critical road junctions. Intelligence indicated that the Germans had established a heavily defended position on a hill designated as Hill 400, overlooking the main approach route. Any attempt to advance would have to pass within direct observation of this position, and the defenders had already demonstrated their ability to call in devastating mortar concentrations on anything that moved. Captain Morrison called Thomas to his command post, along with Lieutenant James Whitfield, the battalion intelligence officer. On the table was an aerial photograph showing Hill 400 and its surrounding terrain. "We've lost 2 reconnaissance patrols trying to get close enough to assess their strength," Whitfield explained. "The latest estimate is a reinforced platoon, maybe 40 men, with at least 2 machine gun positions and a forward observer for their mortar battery. If we can't neutralize that observer, the advance on Schmidt will be extremely costly." Morrison looked at Thomas. "Can you do anything about this?" Thomas studied the photograph for a long time, tracing the contour lines with his finger, noting the direction of the tree shadows in the image. Finally, he asked, "When was this photograph taken?" Whitfield checked his notes. "Approximately 1100 hours, 3 days ago." Thomas nodded slowly. "I need to see this from the ground. Can you get me to this point here?" He indicated a location approximately half a mile south of Hill 400. "We can try," Morrison said. "That area has been quiet. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about shadows," Thomas replied. What Thomas had noticed in the photograph was something so subtle that none of the trained intelligence analysts had registered it. On the eastern slope of Hill 400, there was a narrow ravine, barely visible in the image, where the shadows fell at a slightly different angle than the surrounding terrain. This indicated a depression, a fold in the ground that was deeper than it appeared. More importantly, the shadow pattern suggested that this ravine remained in darkness throughout most of the day, protected from direct sunlight by the ridge above. Thomas spent the next 2 days observing the hill from concealed positions, confirming his theory. The ravine was approximately 15 feet deep and perhaps 200 yards long, running from the base of the hill to within 50 yards of the summit. Its entrance was partially blocked by fallen trees and undergrowth, making it nearly invisible from both the American and German positions. Most significantly, the ravine remained in perpetual shadow, a corridor of darkness that would allow someone to approach the hill completely unseen. On November 4th, Thomas entered the ravine before dawn. He had left behind his pack, his canteen, everything except his rifle, his ammunition, and a small pouch containing dried venison his mother had sent from Oklahoma. He would be in the ravine for at least 18 hours, possibly longer, and he needed to remain absolutely still for most of that time. The ascent took 14 hours. Thomas moved no more than 10 feet per hour in some stretches, waiting through long periods when German soldiers passed within yards of his position. Twice, defenders came to the edge of the ravine to relieve themselves, standing so close that Thomas could smell the tobacco on their breath. He did not move, he did not breathe, he became part of the shadow. By late afternoon, Thomas had reached a position approximately 40 yards from the summit, concealed behind a large boulder where the ravine narrowed to almost nothing. From here he could observe the entire defensive position. He counted 37 men in various positions around the hilltop, including a 2-man observation team in a camouflaged position overlooking the American approach route. He also identified the command post, a reinforced dugout where officers gathered to coordinate the defense. Thomas waited through the night, motionless, watching the routine of the position. He noted when guards changed, when meals were delivered, when officers emerged from the command post. He memorized the patterns, the rhythms of the defense, and he calculated his approach for the following day. At approximately 1400 hours on November 5th, when the afternoon sun was blazing directly into the eyes of the western-facing positions, Thomas began his work. His first target was the forward observer, a corporal who was scanning the American lines through binoculars. The man never saw the threat that came from behind him, from a direction that no one had thought to watch, because it was supposed to be impossible to approach from that angle. What followed was methodical rather than dramatic. Thomas worked for approximately 3 hours, moving from position to position within the shadow of the ravine and the boulder fields at the summit, taking precise shots at intervals timed to coincide with other sounds: the wind in the trees, distant artillery, the noise of vehicles on the road below. Each time he would wait for the confusion to subside before moving to his next firing position. Each time the defenders searched the wrong directions, looking toward the American lines rather than toward the dark ravine behind them. By 1700 hours, Thomas had neutralized 14 defenders, including both machine gun teams and the forward observer. More importantly, he had created such confusion and fear that the remaining men had abandoned their positions on the western slope, crowding into the dugout on the eastern side of the hill. When darkness fell, Thomas slipped back down the ravine and returned to American lines. The advance on Schmidt proceeded the following morning. When American forces reached Hill 400, they found it abandoned. The remaining defenders had withdrawn during the night, unwilling to face another day of being systematically targeted by an adversary they could not see. Documents captured later revealed that the German commander had reported losing nearly half his force to a single unseen opponent and had requested permission to fall back rather than face what he described as psychological destruction. Captain Morrison recommended Thomas for a commendation, citing his neutralization of 14 defenders in a single engagement and his role in enabling the advance toward Schmidt. But the official report barely scratched the surface of what Thomas had accomplished. By his own count, which he kept in a small notebook that survived the conflict, Thomas neutralized 57 defenders during his time in the Hurtgen Forest. 57 men who never saw him coming, who never understood how their supposedly impregnable positions had been penetrated, who fell to a technique developed centuries before any of them were born. The notebook, which Thomas donated to the Cherokee Nation Museum in 1978, contains more than just numbers. It includes detailed sketches of terrain features, notes on shadow patterns at different times of day, and observations on the relationship between light and concealment that read more like a hunter's journal than a military document. In one entry, dated October 31st, Thomas wrote, "Grandfather said the greatest hunter is the one the deer never knows was there. Today I understood what he meant." The Hurtgen Forest campaign continued until February of 1945, ultimately becoming one of the longest single engagements American forces faced during the entire conflict. The forest claimed thousands of casualties on both sides, and many of the lessons learned there would influence military tactics for decades to come. But perhaps the most significant lesson, one that was largely overlooked at the time, came from a Cherokee marksman who proved that the oldest methods of concealment were still effective even in the age of modern conflict. After the conflict in Europe concluded, Thomas Walking Bear returned to Oklahoma. He worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs for several years, helping to establish educational programs on various reservations before retiring to a small farm near Tahlequah. He rarely spoke about his experiences in the forest, except occasionally to younger members of his family who showed interest in the old hunting ways. His grandson, Michael Walking Bear, remembers sitting with him on the porch in the 1970s, watching the sunset over the Ozark foothills. Grandfather Tom would point at the shadows moving across the yard and tell me to watch them carefully. He said that shadows could teach you more about the world than anything else if you knew how to look. I didn't understand what he meant until I read his notebook after he was gone. Thomas Walking Bear passed on peacefully in 1983 at the age of 60. His obituary in the Tulsa World mentioned his military service only briefly. noting that he had been decorated for actions in Europe. It said nothing about the 57 men whose fates he had determined, nothing about the shadow corridors and the ancient knowledge that had made him invisible in a forest far from home. That story, like the shadows he had mastered so completely, remained hidden from view. In 2003, the Cherokee Nation honored Thomas posthumously with a ceremony recognizing his contributions to both his nation and his people. Speakers noted that he had demonstrated the continuing relevance of traditional knowledge in the modern world, proving that the wisdom of ancestors retained its power even in contexts they could never have imagined. A portrait of Thomas now hangs in the Cherokee Heritage Center, showing a young man in uniform, his expression calm and watchful, his eyes holding secrets that the photograph cannot reveal. Military historians have studied Thomas's methods with increasing interest in recent years, recognizing that his intuitive understanding of light and concealment anticipated principles that would later be formalized in advanced camouflage theory. His shadow map technique has been incorporated into training materials at several military institutions, credited to an anonymous marksman from the Second Great Conflict, rather than to a Cherokee hunter who learned it from his grandfather in the Oklahoma hills. Perhaps that anonymity would have pleased Thomas. He never sought recognition for what he accomplished in the Hurtgen forest. In his notebook, in an entry written after the conflict ended, he reflected on his experiences with characteristic modesty. "I did what I was taught to do. The deer that knows you are hunting it will always escape. The deer that never sees you will always fall. I never felt hatred toward those I faced. I simply moved through the forest the way my grandfather taught me, and they were there when I arrived." The technique that made Thomas Walking Bear invisible in the Hurtgen forest was not a military innovation or a technological breakthrough. It was the accumulated wisdom of generations of Cherokee hunters, passed down through storytelling and practice, adapted by a young man far from home to circumstances his ancestors could never have predicted. In a conflict defined by industrial production and technological advancement, his success represented something far older and, in its own way, far more sophisticated. The intimate understanding of the natural world that comes only from patient observation over lifetimes. The Hurtgen forest still stands today, its dense pines and firs growing over the trenches and fighting positions of 1944. Hikers occasionally find rusted artifacts, remnants of equipment left behind by both sides. But the shadows that Thomas Walking Bear navigated so masterfully remain unchanged, falling at the same angles they did 80 years ago, creating the same corridors of darkness that allowed a Cherokee marksman to move unseen through a landscape of constant surveillance. In a final note in his notebook, written many years after the conflict, Thomas returned to the wisdom of his grandfather. "Old Bear told me that a true hunter becomes part of the forest, not separate from it. In Germany, in that terrible place, I was not a soldier hunting other soldiers. I was part of the shadows, and the shadows protected me. I have never forgotten that gift, and I have tried to live my life the same way, moving through the world without disturbing it, leaving no trace of my passing. This is what my grandfather taught me. This is what the shadows taught me. This is the Cherokee way." The story of Thomas Walking Bear represents something larger than one man's remarkable achievements in a forgotten corner of a global conflict. It represents the persistence of traditional knowledge, the adaptability of indigenous wisdom, and the sometimes surprising ways that ancient methods can prove superior to modern technologies. In an age when satellite surveillance and thermal imaging make concealment seemingly impossible, his techniques remind us that the human eye remains susceptible to the same limitations that Cherokee hunters understood centuries ago. The shadow trick that allowed Thomas to neutralize 57 defenders without being seen was not really a trick at all. It was a profound understanding of how light and darkness interact, how the eye perceives movement and shape, and how a patient observer can exploit these fundamental principles. It was knowledge earned through generations of practice, refined through countless hunts in the hills of Oklahoma, and finally applied in circumstances that tested it beyond anything his ancestors could have imagined. Thomas Walking Bear never claimed to be a hero. He saw himself simply as a hunter who had been placed in a situation where his skills were needed. But his story reminds us that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most remarkable achievements are those that leave no trace behind, disappearing into the shadows like the man who made them possible. The lessons Thomas left behind extend far beyond military application. His story teaches us about patience, about the value of ancestral wisdom, and about the power of understanding our environment rather than simply trying to dominate it. In our modern world of constant motion and instant gratification, there is something profoundly valuable in the Cherokee approach that Thomas embodied. The willingness to wait, to observe, to become part of something larger than oneself. His grandson, Michael, has spent years documenting the techniques Old Bear passed down to Thomas, working to preserve this knowledge for future generations. These weren't just hunting skills, Michael explains. They were a way of seeing the world. My great-great-grandfather understood things about light and perception that scientists are still studying today. He didn't have the vocabulary to explain it in technical terms, but he understood it in his bones, and he passed that understanding to my grandfather. Today, the Cherokee Heritage Center includes a permanent exhibit dedicated to Thomas Walking Bear's service and the traditional knowledge that made his achievements possible. Visitors can see reproductions of his notebook entries, study the shadow diagrams he sketched in the Hurtgen forest, and learn about the ancient hunting techniques that gave one young Cherokee man an insurmountable advantage in modern conflict. The exhibit serves as a reminder that wisdom does not always come from technology or formal education, but sometimes from the patient teachings of grandparents and the accumulated experience of generations. Thomas's story also highlights the contributions of Native American service members throughout history, contributions that have often been overlooked or minimized in mainstream accounts. From the code talkers who used indigenous languages to create unbreakable communication systems, to scouts and trackers whose skills proved invaluable in every conflict America has ever faced. Native Americans have served their country with distinction while drawing upon knowledge systems that predate the nation itself. As we reflect on Thomas Walking Bear's remarkable journey from the hills of Oklahoma to the shadows of the Hurtgen forest, we are reminded that true mastery comes not from force but from understanding. His grandfather's lessons, seemingly simple observations about deer and shadows and movement, contain profound truths about perception and concealment that no amount of military training could replicate. Thomas did not overpower his adversaries. He outthought them, using knowledge refined over centuries to accomplish what seemed impossible. The shadows of the Hurtgen forest have seen many seasons since Thomas Walking Bear moved through them with such remarkable skill. The positions he infiltrated have long since returned to nature, the trenches filled with decades of fallen leaves, the dugouts collapsed and overgrown. But somewhere in that ancient woodland, if you know where to look, you might still find the shadow corridors that one Cherokee marksman used to change the course of a campaign. The light still falls at the same angles it did in 1944, creating the same patterns of darkness and illumination that Thomas mapped with such precision. And perhaps that is the most fitting memorial to Thomas Walking Bear, not a statue or a plaque, but the enduring truth of the natural principles he understood so well. As long as the sun rises and sets, as long as light creates shadow, his knowledge remains relevant. The deer in Oklahoma still move according to the patterns Old Bear understood. The shadows in the Hurtgen still offer concealment to those patient enough to use them. And somewhere, our grandchild is learning to watch the shadows move across the yard, carrying forward a tradition that spans generations and continents, connecting the ancient forests of Cherokee homeland to a dark woodland half a world away. This is the legacy of Thomas Walking Bear, not the 57 men he neutralized, but the wisdom he preserved and the traditions he honored. In becoming invisible, he made visible something far more important than himself, the enduring power of ancestral knowledge and the remarkable achievements possible when we learn to work with nature rather than against it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.